Hi everyone, and welcome to Blackout, a poetry writing workshop. My name is Erik Schuckers, and I'm the manager of communications and programming for the Center for Creativity at the University of Pittsburgh. The Center for Creativity is dedicated to making of all kinds, from visual art to music to apps to books, and much, much more. We aim to provide a space for makers of all skill levels, from beginner to pro, to create, collaborate, and connect. In addition to my work at the C4C, I'm also a poet, and one of my special interests is found poetry. Today we're going to make a blackout poem, which is a found poem made by erasing, or blacking out, text from an existing work to create something new. If you're joining us live for this workshop, please make sure your mic is on mute. You can ask questions at any time via Zoom's chat function. I'll keep an eye out there to answer, and I'll also use that area to drop links to examples and other information that might be helpful as we move along. Let's start with what you'll need for this workshop. Blackout poetry is pretty straightforward as far as supplies go. You just need text to work with, a pencil for first drafts, and a Sharpie or other marker to black out your unwanted text. You can make blackout poems from all kinds of text. I've used newspaper articles, wedding announcements, junk mail, pages from a law text, and a printed copy of a presidential inaugural address. Really, you're only limited by your imagination when it comes to selecting raw material. I like to use a pencil and eraser to construct my first draft. You might see poets on YouTube just barreling through circling words with their Sharpies. To me, that's a little like doing the New York Times crossword in pen. It's amazing, but not my speed. I often end up wanting to switch out words or phrases or add others after my first attempt, so a pencil and eraser are important. Sometimes I also like to use a ruler or straight edge to help me black out text, or to draw lines that connect one section of blackout to another in a longer piece, but that's definitely optional. Blackout poetry is a form of found poetry. So what is found poetry? The simplest way to describe it is that it's poetry that uses existing text to make new work by adding to, subtracting from, or dividing it. In this way, it can be thought of as a literary version of collage in visual art, or of remixing or sampling in music. Although found poetry has a long history, it's no accident that it really came to prominence in the mid-20th century when pop art was gaining popularity. There are a lot of parallels between pop art's reframing and recontextualizing of everyday objects, and found poetry's play with language. Erasure and blackout poetry work by subtracting text. The cento or patchwork poem works by adding existing word groups, usually phrases from prose texts or lines from published poems, one to the other to create a new poem. The cut-up divides and recombines words, phrases, or lines from poems or other text sources, sometimes by design and sometimes randomly. So I mentioned blackout and erasure poetry just now. Often these terms are used interchangeably, but sometimes the term erasure is used to indicate a poem with a more elaborate visual style or impact. Blackout poems are usually just that. Text is blacked out in a way that resembles a redacted government document. That has its own unique visual impact. Erasures, like the example here from a really amazing work called A Humument by Tom Phillips, usually incorporate more intense visual arts elements. Their creators may draw, paint, or collage over unused text. The idea is the same. The real difference is in the execution and in the effect you want to create. Speaking of execution, one of the points that often comes up in talking about found poetry is whether or not found poetry can really be thought of as poetry. After all, this reasoning goes, the found poem isn't really original. It just takes an existing text or group of texts and alters it. Without getting too deeply into concepts of originality in art and whether or not it's possible to create something that is truly 100% original, I'd refer to what I think of as the golden rule of found poetry. T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land is one of the most well-known poems of the 20th century. That poem also happens to be, in some sense, a version of a cento or collage poem, combining Eliot's own lines with hundreds of quotes and allusions from writers from Homer and Virgil to Shakespeare to Walt Whitman and Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula. In reflecting on originality in poetry, Eliot wrote that immature poets imitate, mature poets steal. Bad poets deface what they take, and good poets make it into something better, or at least something different. Poetry itself is basically a remix of existing texts, words, into something new. Found poetry, at its best, just uses larger building blocks. Before we get started, I'm going to share a few pro tips for a blackout poem. First, as I mentioned earlier, I recommend using a pencil for your initial draft. Box or circle words or phrases that stand out to you as you move through the first phase of creating your poem. Using a pencil with an eraser will allow you to make adjustments easily before you start blacking out text. Next, remember that poetry works through sense, imagery, and sound. Strict adherence to grammar is not a requirement. Don't get hung up on finding the right article or verb form to connect words or phrases in your poem. And keep an eye out for words within words. Around can become round by blacking out the A. Then can become the by blacking out the N. Third, be aware of where the words and phrases you're working with are located in your source text. In English, our brains are trained to read left to right, top to bottom. That will influence how you assemble your poem. One more point of blackout theory, and then I promise we'll jump into writing. There are two ways to approach the composition of a blackout. One is simply to treat your source text as a kind of word well, which you can dip into for words and images. What results may or may not have any relation to the subject or ideas contained in your source text. For example, you might take a piece of junk mail promoting a new tree service and turn it into a love poem. True story, by the way. The other is to engage with the ideas in your source text and construct a piece in conversation with it. Maybe you read an article on economics, or a legal opinion, or a political column. You find yourself agreeing or disagreeing with the original writer, and are sparked to create something new with the text. Blackouts can argue with or illuminate their source material, support or subvert its positions, assumptions, and language. Neither way is more valid than the other. It's really just a matter of approach and intention. Okay, now we're going to get down to the work, or play, of making your blackout. First, take some time to read through your source text with some of the ideas we've talked about in mind. As you're reading, consider whether you want to engage with the text or whether you want to use it more as a source of words and images. Notice the tone of the writing. Is it bureaucratic, deliberately difficult? Is it technical, a how-to piece? Or written in the bright language of marketing, trying to sell you something? Is it fact or opinion-based? The tone of your source text can affect your finished blackout because the writer has chosen these specific words to have an effect on you. Finally, take a few moments and sit quietly with your source material. Consider how it resonates with you. What drew you to use this particular text instead of something else? For this part of the workshop, I'm going to play some music to keep things going, but feel free to turn the volume down if you'd rather work without it. Okay, let's start reading. We'll take about 3 minutes for this step. All right, still with us? Hopefully that gave you enough time and some ideas about the direction and shape of your blackout. Don't worry if things still feel a little fuzzy. In this step, we'll start to bring our blackouts into sharper focus. Now we're going to zero in on the words and phrases that will anchor our blackouts. Using your pencil, box in or circle words or phrases that stand out to you. Try not to overthink this part. It usually works best if you go on instinct. Since you're using a pencil, you'll be able to review and make changes to your selections in the next step. Right now, just identify what jumps out at you as important or striking. What rings your creative bell when you read it? Are there unusual nouns or strong verbs that hit you? Or images or phrases that you have a strong reaction to? Listen to your instinct. It's pointing you in the right direction. We'll take about 5 minutes for this part, starting now. Welcome back. Now that we've all got some marked up source text, our blackouts should be coming into clearer view. Remember that this workshop will be available on YouTube, so if you'd like to go back and review any step, or take some extra time on one, you can access it anytime. In this step, we're going to revise what we've got so far. Take a look at what you've circled and determine what you'd like to delete or add. Maybe you'd like to add some connecting words to clarify or streamline your poem. Maybe some of what you've circled doesn't fit into the poem that's emerged. This is the time to trim what doesn't fit into this particular poem and add anything that will make your meaning or theme clearer. Use your pencil and eraser as needed. And as another pro tip, read your poem out loud. Reading aloud is a great way to identify what's working and what might not be. Your poem can be as awkward or as fractured as you like. Just make sure that it's deliberately awkward or fractured in the way that you're going for. Revision is the hardest part of the blackout process, so we'll take a little more time with this step. Let's say about 7 minutes. Okay? Go. And we're back. Revising is usually the most time-intensive part of any creative writing, so don't worry if you feel like you didn't quite finish or get your blackout exactly right. We're focusing more on the process here than on making something publication ready. And we've reached the most fun, freeing part of blackout poetry, actually doing the blackout. Now that you have your penciled words and phrases set, outline the ones you want to keep with your marker and start blacking out the rest. If you want, you can use a ruler or another straight edge to make your blackout sharper, but it's kind of great after all the work of selecting and arranging your poem to just freestyle on all that extraneous text you want to get rid of. We'll take about 3 minutes here. So ready, get set, go. All right, so I hope you enjoyed walking through the blackout poem process. Blackouts can be a lot of fun to create, and they're just as much fun to share. They're also a great way to break through creative blocks of any kind. So if you're stuck on a project or just need a shot of inspiration, I recommend reaching for that newspaper or junk mail or old magazine and taking 15 minutes to black out. If you make a poem you feel like sharing with the world, you can take a picture of it and share on social media. Or if you're really dedicated and have the technology, you can scan it instead. We'd love to see what you make. So if you share, please tag us at PitC4C on Twitter or Center for Creativity on Instagram. If you'd like to explore Blackout Poetry a little more, here are some excellent resources. The blackouts done on most of the graphics throughout this workshop are ones that I did using the New York Times online blackout tool. You can find it by searching NYTIMES Blackout Poetry and navigating to the page. The Times has archived a number of its articles, and you can digitally black out your own poems from there. There's also a great TEDx talk by Austin Kleon, who's written lots of blackout poems as well as some books on the creative process. Steal Like an Artist is a great intro to many of the ideas behind found poetry, and blackouts in particular. Just search Austin Kleon Steal on YouTube. You can also follow the Blackout Poetry or Blackout Poem tags on Instagram to see what other creators are doing. Blackouts and erasures have become wildly popular on Instagram, and there are lots of people working in the forum that you can follow for ideas and inspiration. Finally, the Found Poetry Review is a wonderful source for information on found poetry of all kinds, and it includes how-tos and prompts for trying new writing methods. Unfortunately, the review is no longer updated, but you can still access its archives at foundpoetryreview.com.